They will tell you she was a pioneer. They will tell you she was brave, determined, the embodiment of freedom in the sky. But they will never tell you about the things she carried inside her mind, or the whispers she heard from the men who funded her flights. July 2nd, 1937, is remembered as the day Amelia Earhart vanished into the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. But long before that morning, the seeds of her disappearance had already been planted years before she even touched the controls of an aeroplane. Amelia was born in a world that didn't want her to fly, in an America where women were supposed to stay grounded, invisible, obedient. She grew up in Kansas, a restless child in a house haunted by instability. Her father's alcoholism and financial ruin taught her early that the world could strip you of everything if you weren't prepared to fight. She was drawn to danger without ever admitting it, not for the thrill, but for the control it gave her over a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. In her youth, she wasn't yet the legend. She was a nurse during the Spanish flu, watching hundreds of soldiers slip into death's grip. She saw the way institutions managed cold, mechanical. Death was paperwork to them. It stayed with her. And then came that first flight, a moment so intoxicating it rewrote her DNA. After only 10 minutes in the air, she knew the ground could never hold her again. But flight wasn't just freedom, it was power. And power attracts the kind of attention you cannot escape. She bought her own plane, the Canary, and pushed it higher than any other woman had dared. The papers called her daring. The men behind closed doors called her useful. Because in the early days of aviation, planes were not just for exploration, they were tools of surveillance, weapons in waiting, and symbols in an emerging game of psychological control over entire populations. Amelia Earhart was stepping into a world where flight was political, where every altitude record and every headline was quietly shaping the will of the masses. The same men who praised her would one day sign the papers that sealed her fate. She didn't know it then, but the path from Kansas farm girl to international icon was already mapped in. It didn't end in the clouds. It ended somewhere one was meant to find. The story they print in school textbooks paints her rise as a clean, upward climber woman, overcoming odds through grit and charm. But the truth is always messier. Amelia's path to the sky was paved not only with ambition, but with debts, compromises, and hands she had to shake that she did not trust. After her early flights, she faced financial collapse. Planes were expensive. Fame was fickle, and sponsors demanded a return on their investment. In Boston, she worked quietly, teaching and writing about aviation, trying to keep herself in the game while the world's eyes shifted elsewhere. It was in these years that she began to understand the other side of flight, the politics of who gets to be in the air and why. In 1928, her life took its first decisive turn toward myth. A wealthy socialite, Amy Phipps Guest, had planned to become the first woman to cross the Atlantic by air. But when her family forbade it, they sought a replacement, a woman who could be shaped into a symbol. Amelia was chosen not because she was the most experienced pilot, but because she looked the part, tall, photogenic, with a disarming mix of confidence and humility. She was, in the words of one organizer, a woman the public could rally behind. They called it an opportunity. In truth, it was a carefully staged performance. On June 17, 1928, Amelia climbed aboard the Friendship, but she wasn't at the controls for most of the journey. Mechanical issues and harsh conditions meant her role was reduced to that of a passenger figurehead carried across the ocean. Still, when they landed in Buryport, Wales, the headlines screamed, "First woman flies Atlantic." It didn't. Matter that she hadn't flown it herself. The public believed, and that belief was all that mattered to the men behind the curtain. From that moment, she was no longer just Amelia Earhart. She was a brand. And, like all brands, she could be used, directed, and, if necessary, destroyed. Behind the applause, she sensed the quiet hands that moved her like a chess piece. Each interview, each endorsement, each public appearance was choreographed. They were building her up, and in the game of power, those who are built up can be torn down at will. The applause of 1928 was not just the sound of celebration. It was the first echo of the silence that would one day swallow her whole. In the years that followed, Amelia's public image hardened into something untouchable, almost saint-like. She became the face of modern womanhood, confident, daring, unafraid to challenge the boundaries men had drawn around the skies. But those closest to her knew there was a cost to carrying that image. She lived under constant pressure, not only to keep flying, but to keep selling the idea of Amelia Earhart. Her manager and eventual husband, George Putnam, was a master of media manipulation. He understood that fame was currency and that Amelia's value depended on maintaining the illusion of perfection. Every photograph was staged, every statement was measured, and every flight was an act not just of aviation, but of theater. Yet Amelia was not content to remain a symbol. She craved control over her own destiny, and she began to take on flights that were more dangerous, more unpredictable, and less commercially safe. The Great Depression was tightening its grip on America, and public appetite for larger-than-life heroes grew desperate. Amelia stepped into that role willingly, but with each risk, she moved further from the safe path her sponsors preferred. Her solo transatlantic flight in 1932, this time with her own hands on the controls, cemented her as a genuine pioneer. She was no longer just a passenger in her own story, but that independence came at a cost. Sponsors began to grow wary of her unpredictability. The press, always hungry for drama, started whispering about arrogance and recklessness. And in the shadows, the quiet network of men who had helped build her brand began to watch more closely, calculating whether she was still an asset or whether she was becoming a liability. Amelia knew this world. She had learned to read the coded language of backroom deals and half smiles that meant danger. The more she pushed against the boundaries, the more she sensed the walls closing in. It was no longer just about flying. It was about survival in a game where the stakes were higher than she had imagined. And as she planned her most ambitious journey yet, a flight around the world, there were whispers, not just of admiration, but of warning. The kind of warning that doesn't come in the form of advice, but in the form of silence. A silence that told her she was stepping into a territory from which there might be no return. By early 1937, Amelia had meticulously planned her round-the-world flight. She had chosen her route with surgical precision, calculating fuel loads, weather patterns, and navigational hazards that would challenge even the most seasoned pilots. But the world she was about to enter was no longer the open sky of her early days. It was a place layered with unseen forces, bureaucracies, and hidden agendas. She had acquired a Lockheed Electra 10E, a machine as complex and temperamental as the men who sought to control the airways. Every bolt, every gauge, every radio circuit was scrutinized, yet some failures were beyond human prediction. Those close to her later hinted at mysterious last-minute adjustments to the aircraft changes she never fully understood, implemented by mechanics with backgrounds that were murky, even suspicious. On June 1, 1937, Amelia departed from Miami, Florida, for her first leg to South America. She carried not just fuel and maps, but the weight of expectation. Newspapers tracked her progress obsessively, broadcasting every waypoint to a public desperate for sensation. And yet, there were moments during that initial leg when something felt off. Radios sputtered at odd intervals. Instruments flickered in ways that defied explanation. Even seasoned co-pilots began to whisper about inconsistencies in navigation. Charts that should have been foolproof. By the time she reached Brazil, a sense of foreboding had already crept into her minder. Subtle tension that had nothing to do with weather or mechanical systems. Those who studied her route later noted anomalies, places where her flight path seemed to drift inexplicably, areas over open ocean that should have been avoided, yet she passed through them without comment, whether by miscalculation, coincidence, or a darker hand. Amelia was entering a zone where the known laws of flight intersected with something more insidious, something that would test not just her skills, but her very understanding of reality. Even those who had followed her career for years sensed a shift in her demeanor. Reports describe moments of intense focus, almost trance-like states during long stretches of flying, as if she were attuned to forces invisible to anyone else in the cockpit. And as she approached the vast, empty Pacific, she was no longer simply navigating air currents. She was moving into a theater of shadows, where a single misstep or, perhaps, a single hidden hand could erase one of history's most luminous figures forever. The last confirmed sighting of Amelia Earhart took place on July 2nd, 1937, as she approached Howland Island, a tiny speck in the vast Pacific, barely large enough to be seen from the air. The radio communications from that day reveal a fractured and desperate dialogue, punctuated by static, cryptic position reports and repeated attempts to locate the island. "We are on the line 157,337, she transmitted, a phrase that would haunt historians and conspiracy theorists for decades. But what those messages conceal is far darker than mere navigational uncertainty. The Electra's radio was functioning sporadically, yet even when it did, strange interference disrupted the signal's patterns that some experts later suggested were not accidental. There were whispers among the ground crew and Navy officers, monitoring the transmission logs, that Amelia's messages were being overridden, filtered, or perhaps intercepted in ways that were never fully explained. Her navigator, Fred Noonan, had experienced traversing vast oceans, yet the final leg to Howland Island seemed almost impossibly precise and simultaneously flawed. The aircraft's trajectory, reconstructed from sparse data and eyewitness reports, implies a bizarre deviation, an inexplicable drift that took them away from the island by miles. What exactly occurred in those final hours has never been resolved, and the more investigators examine the evidence, the stranger it becomes. Even the few sightings reported by nearby ships or islanders are contradictory, as if the world itself was conspiring to conceal the truth. Some claim the plane was spotted, burning low over the water. Others insist it vanished into a fog that had not been forecast. The official search launched by the US Navy failed to find a trace, and yet fragments recovered decades later suggest a narrative far more sinister than accidental disappearance. Were mechanical failures the cause, or was this a carefully orchestrated trap? Who, if anyone, would have wanted to erase Amelia Earhart from history in such a cold, methodical manner? As the Electra disappeared over the horizon, it left behind not just confusion, but a vacuum where knowledge should have been a void that invites speculation, conspiracy, and fear. Every subsequent expedition, every recovered artifact, every fragment of metal tells a story that hints at hidden agendas, silent observers, and forces operating in secrecy. The ocean swallowed Amelia, but the questions she left behind remain, echoing across decades. Did she crash? Was she captured? Or did she stumble upon truths that were never meant for human eyes? The answer, if it exists, is buried beneath layers of deception, guarded by those who control not only history, but the narrative of what we are allowed to know. To understand the full scope of Amelia Earhart's disappearance, we must return to the foundations of her life, her childhood, the seeds of her ambition, and the invisible pressures that shaped her destiny. Born into a family of privilege, yet stricken with instability, Amelia's early years were defined by displacement, a sense of unfulfilled promise, an exposure to the contradictions of wealth and expectation. Her father's erratic career moves, combined with her mother's relentless insistence on propriety and social standing, created a psychological crucible that hardened her resolve. She learned early that independence was both a risk and a weapon. Obedience could be stifling, but defiance came at a cost. When she witnessed the aftermath of World War I in Toronto, tending to wounded soldiers as a Red Cross aide, she glimpsed human vulnerability and institutional inefficiency, the fragility of life and the hidden machinery of authority. These experiences, coupled with her own near-fatal battle with the 1918 Spanish flu and chronic sinus infections, carved a steely edge into her character. Pain, isolation, and physical limitation became silent tutors, teaching her endurance, patience, and a willingness to confront danger directly. Aviation entered her life not as a whim, but as an answer to a subconscious call and escape from the invisible cages of expectation and mortality. Each flight, each altitude record, each painstaking solo journey across oceans was an act of defiance against forces she could not yet name. By the early 1930s, Amelia had become a public icon, celebrated for breaking records. But privately, she understood the paradox of fame. It offered protection, yet exposure to power and influence carried its own subtle threats. Behind the glamour of headlines, behind the public image of courage, there were meetings, connections, and whispers intersections with elites, financiers, and military figures who recognized her potential as a symbol, as a tool, as a message. These entanglements, rarely recorded and often dismissed, may have set the stage for her final mission. Was she simply a pilot chasing a personal dream, or had she become a pawn in a larger design, an unknowing participant in a narrative of strategic, geopolitical, and perhaps clandestine interest? When the Electra took off toward Howland Island, it carried not only fuel and equipment, but the weight of ambition, the silent pressures of authority, and the invisible forces of a world that rewards daring and punishes curiosity. Her disappearance, therefore, cannot be understood merely as an aviation accident. It is a chapter in a story of power, secrecy, and hidden motives that the public is not meant to uncover. Amelia Earhart's life, like her final flight, was a collision of courage and conspiracy, a test of human will against forces that operate unseen. By 1937, Amelia Earhart was no longer simply a pilot. She was a symbol, a living icon whose every movement was watched, recorded, and dissected by the public and by those in power. Her decision to attempt a round-the-world flight was presented as a personal ambition, a daring adventure for history books. But beneath the surface lay a network of interests, both known and concealed. The plane itself, a Lockheed Electra 10E, was a technological marvel, yet it was also a machine with vulnerabilities, its very design and weight distribution, fuel capacity, and navigation instruments would become central to the mystery that would engulf her. Her route was meticulously planned, with stops designed for refueling, rest, and recalibration, but the path was also fraught with logistical challenges, political oversight, and environmental unpredictability. As the Electra lifted from Miami, on May 20th, 1937, the world cheered a spectacle of courage. Yet few understood that each leg of the journey brought Amelia closer to invisible currents of danger. The Atlantic, the Caribbean, the South American coasts, all these stretches of airspace were monitored by governments and private interests, and each stop required negotiation, coordination, and silent compliance with regulations often hidden from public view. Her companion's navigator, Fred Noonan, and support teams on the ground were selected not just for skill, but for trustworthiness in the eyes of those orchestrating the journey from the shadows. The dynamics of command, control, and influence were subtle but omnipresent. Noonan's calculations, the plane's mechanical checks, the weather reports, all were points of potential manipulation, error, or sabotage, whether accidental or deliberate. As she crossed continents and oceans, Amelia was no longer simply traversing physical distances. She was navigating a labyrinth of unseen forces, testing the limits of human endurance against environmental, mechanical, and institutional pressures. The further she flew, the narrower the margin between triumph and catastrophe, freedom and disappearance. By the time the Electra approached the remote stretches of the Pacific, the stakes had shifted from achievement to survival. The very mechanisms of aviation, public fascination, and geopolitical scrutiny converged, creating conditions where one misstep or perhaps one orchestrated move could erase a person from the record of history. Her final communications, fragmented, and cryptic, hint at both technical struggle and unseen interference. The world would never again hear her voice clearly, and in that silence, a darkness began to take shape. Darkness filled with unanswered questions, hidden agendas, and the possibility that Earhart's fate was no accident at all. As Amelia Earhart pressed further into the Pacific skies, the vastness of the ocean became both a stage and a trap, a mirror reflecting the fragile human ambition against the immensity of forces beyond control. Every transmission she made to Howland Island was monitored, logged, and yet, in the end, strangely, incomplete. The last known coordinates, faint and erratic, spoke not only of navigational struggle, but hinted at interference, deliberate or accidental, that has never been fully explained. Historians and aviation experts would later debate the readings, the radio frequencies, and the signals lost in static, but in that moment, Earhart and Noonan were isolated in a vacuum of responsibility and danger. The Electra, a marvel of engineering, was subjected to environmental extremes it was never truly tested to withstand: relentless sun, fluctuating air pressure, unpredictable winds, and the insidious weight of human expectation. Noonan, whose charts and calculations had guided transoceanic flights before, now faced the ultimate test, a navigation puzzle spread across a watery desert with no visible landmarks and failing instruments. The world below was a patchwork of conflicting reports, and the strategic position of Howland Island, a mere speck on the map, made every mile a negotiation with unseen forces, with chance itself. And then there are the shadows of conspiracy, whispered in the corridors of power, that suggest the flight may have been observed, monitored, or even manipulated by entities whose interest in Earhart's disappearance remains unspoken but ever present. Was it a simple accident, the natural failure of machine and man against an unforgiving environment, or something darker, carefully orchestrated, vanishing, designed to remove her from sight, leaving history and legend to fill the gaps. The impossibility of her final hours has birthed theories that range from navigational miscalculation to secret military capture, to covert missions cloaked in the language of adventure. Her final radio messages, broken and incomplete, carry an eerie sense of forewarning, as though she glimpsed the edges of forces she could not understand, forces that would soon consume her. The Pacific became an abyss not only of water, but of hidden truths, a void that swallowed not just a woman and her navigator, but the certainty of their era, the confidence of progress, and the faith of those who believed modernity could tame nature. Every attempt to reconstruct the flight reveals only fragments like shards of glass, reflecting a story too dangerous to see in full. And in those shards, the unease persists. The Earhart's disappearance was not merely a tragedy of circumstance, but a doorway into a deeper darkness. A history deliberately obscured, a crime whose architects remain invisible, leaving the world to search endlessly for answers that may never exist. By the time the sun rose over the Pacific, the Electra was already entangled in a web of uncertainty, its engines laboring against invisible currents, its compass a stubborn prisoner to magnetic anomalies. Earhart's voice, calm but resolute, cut through the static, sending fragments of her presence into the void, each transmission a ghostly marker of a life on the brink. To the world listening, her words were cryptic and final, a breadcrumb trail in a vast, indifferent ocean. What happened next has never been witnessed, never confirmed. But every theory carries the same pulse of dread. A disappearance that was complete, absolute, and meticulously erased from the record of living memory. When historians and investigators examine the meticulous planning of her flights, the precise calculations of fuel, altitude, and drift, a pattern emerges that hints at deliberate oversights or worse, manipulation. The Electra, though state-of-the-art, was vulnerable in ways that were invisible to the casual observer. Could the plane have been compromised before departure? Could unknown forces have altered the course, ensuring that Earhart and Noonan would never reach the tiny green target that promised salvation? Some researchers point to anomalies in flight logs, irregularities in radio frequencies, and strange bureaucratic interference from military authorities, suggesting that the disappearance may have been facilitated by an unseen hand. The more the evidence is scrutinized, the more contradictions appear. Sightings reported decades later, fragments of metal with disputed authenticity, eyewitness accounts from remote islands that conflict with each other, and classified documents that hint at covert operations in the Pacific. Each clue seems both compelling and misleading, like pieces of a puzzle deliberately scattered. And as the years pass, Earhart becomes less a person and more a symbol of ambition swallowed by darkness, of history rewritten to obscure the truth, of courage trapped in an unsolvable enigma. Her name evokes awe, but also unease, because every account, every memorial, every tribute carries an undercurrent of absence, a void where answers should reside. Those who study her disappearance report an almost tangible presence of secrecy, as if the very waters of the Pacific are layered with hidden eyes, watching and recording while the truth drifts eternally beneath the waves. To understand Earhart's last flight is to confront the unsettling possibility that history itself may have been altered, that the disappearance was not an accident but an orchestrated vanishing, a message disguised as tragedy, and a warning of the forces that operate beyond public scrutiny. Those who dare to follow the trail quickly realize this is not merely a story about a lost aviator, but a descent into the mechanics of control, secrecy, and the dangerous intersections between human ambition and hidden power. In the weeks and months that followed Earhart's disappearance, an eerie silence blanketed the narrative, broken only by scattered reports of mysterious signals intercepted over the Pacific, coded messages that some claim originated from the Electra itself. Authorities dismissed these as static and imagination, but insiders whispered of unacknowledged transmissions, deliberately ignored or erased from official records. Theories emerged suggesting that Earhart may have been captured, or worse, lured into territories controlled by clandestine military experiments. Secret operations in the Pacific, conducted under the guise of routine patrols, were known to manipulate flight paths, monitor communications, and sometimes eliminate inconvenient variables like Amelia Earhart, a woman whose fame and skill made her both a national treasure and a potential threat to unseen agendas. Every report of wreckage, every fragment of metal found on remote atolls was carefully catalogued, studied, and then quietly hidden or lost in archives that were never meant to be public. Observers noted anomalies in her flight plan, inconsistencies in the recorded weather data, and gaps in the chain of command overseeing the mission. Some of these gaps seem impossible, as if the flight itself was deliberately insulated from oversight, stripped of transparency so that when it vanished, no one could fully trace its path. Meanwhile, the world fixated on memorials and tributes, stamps, statues, and ceremonial flights, each honoring a heroine whose fate remained a riddle wrapped in a void. Yet behind this public reverence, the deeper story remained hidden, of potential betrayal, of systems designed to obscure and mislead, of records that might have held the truth but were altered, misplaced, or destroyed. Earhart's disappearance became more than a tragedy. It became a case study in obfuscation, a lesson in how power can erase the evidence of human ambition. And as decades passed, the story mutated in collective memory, giving birth to myths, conspiracy theories, and half-whispered legends. Each theory, while plausible, was haunted by the same question: why? In a world that could track ocean liners, decode enemy transmissions, and map continents, did a woman with a perfectly planned route vanish without a trace? The answer, if it exists, has never been revealed, and perhaps never will be. What we are left with is a chilling certainty. Something in those final hours of flight was orchestrated beyond our comprehension. A dangerous intersection of skill, fame, and forces that operate in shadows. Earhart's Electra, now a ghostly vessel, symbolizes the terrifying possibility that some truths are never meant to reach the surface, that some secrets are enforced by systems more ruthless than we can imagine, and that history itself may protect the guilty by erasing the innocent. By the late 1930s, Earhart's fame had grown to a level that attracted not just admirers, but also those who understood the power of symbols. Her aircraft, the Electra, became more than a machine. It was a vessel of influence, representing female independence, courage, and technical mastery in a world still dominated by men. Some historians suggest that such prominence drew the attention of hidden networks, government factions, industrial elites, even intelligence operatives who saw the potential to exploit her visibility for agendas that could never be made public. In the months leading to her final flight, there were subtle, almost imperceptible pressures, last-minute modifications to her flight plan, unexplained adjustments to the equipment, and cryptic warnings dismissed as casual advice. The public only knew the polished version, the record attempt, the round-the-world flight, but behind closed doors, an undercurrent of control pulsed through every decision. Amelia herself, despite her charisma and reputation for fearlessness, was not immune to these invisible forces. Some witnesses later recounted meetings where officials questioned her meticulously, probing for knowledge of her route navigation, tools, and communications capabilities. Others whispered that her mission was observed not merely for safety but for intelligence purposes, to chart Pacific territories, to test navigational techniques, to gather information under the pretense of adventure. Whether she understood the depth of these machinations is uncertain, but it is undeniable that the stage was set for an intersection of ambition and unseen agendas. When the Electra took off from Lae, New Guinea on that fateful day, it carried not only fuel and supplies, but also the weight of scrutiny from forces that would never disclose their involvement. For the world, the flight was daring and glamorous. For the hidden observers, it was an experiment, a calculated risk that balanced fame against secrecy. Hours into the journey, radio communications faltered. Reports suggest that multiple signals from the aircraft were either garbled or mysteriously absent, creating an information vacuum. Those trained in deciphering these anomalies saw patterns in the chaos, hints that the Electra's final moments were manipulated, its position monitored and perhaps even guided by unseen hands. The official search would later be lauded as exhaustive, but insiders noted key oversights. Searches were delayed, coordinates were ignored, and certain eyewitness reports never reached command centers. Every omission, every delay, every fragment of contradictory testimony hints at something darker, a systemic interference with the natural course of events. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart was no accident. It was a perfect storm of talent, ambition, and unseen orchestration, a disappearance that has been shrouded for decades in layers of narrative, carefully constructed to obscure the underlying truth, and the chilling realization remains. The Electra did not merely vanish, it was made to vanish. As night fell over the Pacific, the Electra became a ghost in the sky, invisible to the untrained eye, but tracked by those who understood its significance. Navigation logs show Earhart following the intended route toward Howland Island, but discrepancies appear in the time-stamped positions, as if the aircraft had been subtly redirected. Weather reports from that day reveal anomalies: sudden fog, banks that materialized without warning, wind shifts inconsistent with recorded patterns, and radio static that inexplicably silenced crucial communications. Earhart and Noonan, seasoned and meticulous, would not have miscalculated under normal circumstances, yet every element of their flight that day seems to have conspired against them. Some researchers suggest that strategic electronic interference, a technology emerging quietly in military circles, may have created phantom signals, misleading the aircraft's instruments and confusing navigation readings. The Electra, powerful and precise, was suddenly at the mercy of invisible forces. Meanwhile, back in the United States, public fascination with Earhart reached a fever pitch. Newspapers speculated, theorized, and romanticized, but none could grasp the machinery of secrets operating behind the scenes. The disappearance was not simply about a plane lost over water. It was about a high-profile figure intersecting with the opaque systems of power. Intelligence operatives of the Eerie, some American, some foreign, had an interest in Pacific mapping, in testing radio transmission, interference, and in observing the limits of endurance under duress. Earhart, unknowingly, became the central figure in a live experiment. Personal accounts from crew members involved in the search hint at contradictions. Ships redirected, planes grounded under unclear orders, messages altered or delayed. Even decades later, investigators unearthed letters and cables suggesting that authorities knew more than they disclosed. Every attempt to reconstruct the final moments of the Electra is obstructed by incomplete records, inconsistencies in testimony, and deliberate gaps where the truth should be. Noonan's skill as navigator was unmatched, yet the logs indicate errors he would never have made. The evidence points toward interference, manipulation, and control forces beyond mere chance. As the Electra vanished from sight, the first layer of legend began to form. A daring flight, a heroic woman lost to the sea. But beneath the heroics lies a darker narrative, one of calculated oversight, systemic erasure, and the subtle orchestration of disappearance by those who recognized that some truths are too dangerous for public knowledge. The Electra's shadow drifted over the Pacific, carrying Amelia and Fred into the uncharted territory of secret histories that governments, agencies, and powerful interests would guard jealously for decades. And in that silence, the first questions that would never fully be answered were planted, waiting for anyone bold enough to look past the surface of the official story. The immediate aftermath of the disappearance revealed a strange pattern of obfuscation. Search efforts, while officially massive, were plagued by conflicting instructions. Ships sent in the wrong directions, and planes recalled at critical moments. Radio transmissions intercepted by nearby stations suggest that some signals from the Electra may have reached land, faint and garbled, yet never acted upon. Investigators at the time assumed the worst: fuel exhaustion, oceanic miscalculation, or storm interference. But decades of declassified communications indicate that multiple agencies had their own eyes on the Electra's flight, monitoring, recording, and even attempting covert contact. What emerges from these documents is not mere misfortune. It is a calculated network of silence and redirection. Every delay, every contradictory report, every erased or misfiled record appears less accidental and more orchestrated. Even witnesses involved in the initial search describe anomalies, unexpected calm seas where storms were forecast, abrupt shifts in wind patterns, and navigation lights that flickered in impossible sequences. Could these have been deliberate manipulations of the environment to conceal something far larger? The Electra's disappearance became the perfect story for the public heroism. Tragedy, mystery, while the hidden narrative, far more sinister, was quietly sealed. Consider the geopolitical context. 1937 was a year when intelligence networks were expanding across the Pacific, testing radio transmissions and mapping remote islands for strategic purposes. A civilian flight like Earhart's, but an international, presented a perfect opportunity to study vulnerabilities in aviation, communications, and logistics. The Electra may have become an unintended participant in an early experiment in psychological control and technological manipulation. Letters recovered decades later revealed tensions between search coordinators and government authorities, disputes over which information could be released and which had to vanish. The story of Amelia Earhart was being written in real time, yet the truth was systematically excised from public view. Every piece of evidence that might reveal interference or intentional misdirection disappeared into classified archives, leaving only fragments: a compass reading that doesn't align, a weather report contradicted by multiple sources, a search plane that inexplicably turns back. These fragments form a pattern when viewed through the lens of suspicion, a network of hidden agendas, power plays, and control over information that transformed a simple flight into a legend of unresolved disappearance. And while the public mourned, speculated, and mythologized, the real story, the story of engineered disappearance, manipulation of evidence, and deliberate concealment behind the veil. Those who probe too deeply into these hidden corridors of truth risk unsettling the very foundations of what has been accepted as history. For what you are about to see is a descent into a labyrinth where no one returns unchanged, where every clue hints at forces that operate silently, efficiently, and with dangerous precision. As the initial shock of the disappearance faded, an eerie silence took hold over the Pacific. Official reports claimed exhaustive searches, yet numerous eyewitnesses recounted strange occurrences near the projected flight path. Fishermen, isolated on tiny atolls, described seeing an unusual aircraft circling at low altitude, sometimes appearing illuminated, sometimes shrouded in unnatural fog. These accounts were dismissed as delusions or misidentifications, but when cross-referenced with secret naval logs, the timing and locations align with Earhart's intended route. Beyond the natural elements, a pattern emerges in the timing of distress signals. Radio operators in remote stations claimed to have intercepted faint, coded messages, fragmented phrases like lost, cannot land, coordinates shifting, but these transmissions were never logged in official records. The gaps suggest deliberate suppression. Why would authorities ignore signals from a world-famous aviator? The answer lies buried in geopolitical shadows. 1937 marked a period of rising tensions across the Pacific, with intelligence agencies conducting covert surveillance on territories now under Japanese and American interest. Earhart's flight, innocent on the surface, may have intersected sensitive zones, areas mapped for military expansion, or islands used for clandestine experiments. Some historians hypothesize that the Electra's disappearance was leveraged to study the reaction of the media, public sentiment, and international communication channels, testing the power of narrative control. Survivors of subsequent expeditions report remnants of the Electra twisted metal, fragments of instruments found on uninhabited islands, yet these discoveries were either ignored or classified. Even photographs taken during post-war reconnaissance reveal anomalies, disturbed sand, small structures that don't appear on contemporary maps, and artifacts inconsistent with known settlements. Could Earhart have been captured or even used as a pawn in early intelligence operations? Some testimonies from locals suggest sightings of a foreign woman on remote islands during the months following the disappearance, her presence undocumented in any official account. These testimonies, collected decades later, were often dismissed, but they echo a chilling possibility that Earhart survived longer than recorded, only to be systematically erased from the narrative. The Electra itself, a marvel of aviation, vanished into obscurity, leaving only its shadow in history and sporadic sightings reported by those brave or foolish enough to speak. Each piece of evidence, each whisper of a signal, forms a pattern pointing to intentional manipulation. What appears as accident, incompetence, or bad luck may in truth have been a carefully orchestrated operation. The line between fact and fabrication blurs as you follow the trailer trail, where every fragment, every suppressed account, challenges the comfortable truths handed to the world. The Electra's fate, and Earhart's own, is no longer just a mystery of aviation. It is a study in control, secrecy, and the dark art of erasing a life from history while leaving just enough smoke to to create a legend. The deeper you delve into the disappearance, the more the official story fractures. Earhart's communications, prior to vanishing, are often portrayed as routine flight chatter, but declassified documents hint at coded deviations, subtle signals, cryptic instructions embedded within standard messages. Only a trained operator could detect them, suggesting that Earhart herself may have been aware of hidden operations tied to her route. Some researchers have speculated that her journey coincided with covert reconnaissance for the US military, mapping islands, ocean currents, and radio transmission patterns that would later be critical in the Pacific theater of World War II. The Electra, loaded with supplies and instruments beyond ordinary aviation requirements, may have carried equipment that the public never knew existed. Eyewitness accounts describe unusual appendages on the plane, strange antennas, and extra cargo that was never fully investigated. There are also whispers of government interest in Earhart's unique skills. Her navigation abilities, her endurance, her public profile made her an ideal subject for controlled experiments in psychological pressure and survival under extreme conditions. The logs of naval observers in the Central Pacific contain disturbing entries, instances of unexpected atmospheric phenomena, compass readings that fluctuated wildly, and unidentified vessels maneuvering in coordination with the flight path. One officer's note, classified until decades later, reads simply, "Electra presence detected, maintain observation, do not interfere unless instructed." The meaning of this cryptic directive remains unclear, but it implies that Earhart was being watched, possibly tracked by forces unknown to her. On Howland Island, the supposed refueling point, local accounts diverge dramatically from the official version. Natives recalled strange activity on the island prior to the flight structures that appeared overnight, unusual radio signals, and personnel who never appeared in public records. Could the island have been part of an unacknowledged military outpost, a silent stage for the disappearance? The Electra's final moments are obscured by fog, both literal and metaphorical. Radio logs show intermittent signals, sometimes overlapping with Japanese maritime communications, sometimes entirely missing. The plane may have drifted, intentionally or forced by unseen forces, into areas of strategic interest, leaving Earhart in a liminal zone between survival and oblivion. Every recovered artifact, every faded photo, every testimony ignored by mainstream history reinforces the notion that this was not a simple accident. It was a carefully veiled incident, one that manipulated perception, rewrote reality, and ensured that the truth would remain tantalizingly out of reach. To understand what happened to Amelia Earhart is to confront a labyrinth of deception, power, and secrecy that extends far beyond the cockpit of a single airplane into the hidden corridors, where history is rewritten in silence. The Electra did not vanish into thin air. It entered a shadowed network of observation and control. Post-disappearance investigations reveal anomalies that the public record either ignores or subtitles. Flight logs intercepted by radio operators hint at an alternate trajectory, one that would place Earhart in proximity to islands that were being covertly surveyed for military fortifications. These islands were marked on classified maps, absent from civilian charts, and yet crucial for operations that would emerge years later. The disappearance coincided with an intensifying global race for Pacific dominance, a theater unseen by the mainstream narrative. Intelligence reports, recently declassified, suggest that Earhart may have been deliberately lured into zones where radio silence and navigational interference were systematically deployed. There are accounts from naval observers describing a sudden loss of signal in regions previously stable, followed by intermittent, distorted communications, suggesting that some form of electromagnetic manipulation could have been employed. The Electra itself, equipped with experimental radio equipment, may have been transmitting beyond conventional channels, making Earhart a moving beacon in a hidden intelligence game. Even her last known positions contradict official statements. Witness testimonies from the islands near Howland Island describe seeing the plane in a different quadrant, at altitudes inconsistent with standard approach protocols. Could Earhart have been navigating under duress, forced to comply with unknown signals, her fate intertwined with strategic objectives she never fully understood? Meanwhile, reports of Japanese reconnaissance activities in the same period remain tantalizingly unverified, yet eerily consistent. Some researchers claim that local fishermen and island residents observed a large aircraft circling multiple times before vanishing, as if being guided or herded by unseen forces. When artifacts surfaced decades later, fragments of the Electra showed signs of minor tampering or modifications inconsistent with standard flight wear and tear, hinting at intervention by hands that had motives beyond mere recovery. Every new piece of evidence, each recovered note, and radio transcript paints a pattern of orchestrated disappearance, not accidental crash. Earhart's vanishing becomes a blueprint for controlled absence and operation designed to remove her from the public eye while preserving the spectacle of her heroism for propaganda. The Electra transforms from aircraft to instrument of mystery, its roots encoded with invisible directives. Its disappearance a signal to those trained to read the invisible lines of power and secrecy. In this hidden narrative, Earhart is no longer merely a pioneer or victim. She becomes an unwitting participant in a far-reaching game of surveillance, control, and historical obfuscation, where truth is a dangerous commodity and the real story exists only in fragments, whispers, and classified shadows, as days turned into weeks after Earhart's disappearance. The world clutched at fragments of information, yet a deeper, more sinister pattern began to emerge. Official reports claimed exhaustive searches, yet records reveal gaps. Zones left intentionally unscoured, and entire areas ignored despite credible sightings. These omissions are not errors, they are signatures of deliberate concealment. Whispers from retired military officers, long silenced by fear or oath, hint at coordinated misdirection. One account describes radar anomalies on the night of July 2, 1937, that should have alerted search teams but were inexplicably dismissed as instrument error. Coincidence, or a controlled narrative designed to make a disappearance seem mysterious while masking the underlying orchestration. In the weeks following the flight, classified communications within naval intelligence reveal references to unexpected targets and aircraft deviation patterns, suggesting monitoring of the Electra far beyond any civilian comprehension. Documents, redacted for decades, point to covert operations in the Central Pacific, with islands acting as nodes in a network designed for surveillance and, potentially, detention. Some historians propose that Earhart's presence in these zones was never accidental. Her flight path intersected sensitive areas, coinciding with testing of long-range communications, navigational jamming, and early reconnaissance networks. The Electra, under her control yet unknowingly subject to interference, became a pawn in an invisible chessboard where the players remained hidden from the public eye. Even the timing of her last transmission carries peculiar significance. The phrasing and cadence suggest a structured, almost coded message rather than a casual radio check, raising questions about who or what was dictating the airspace she traversed. Local island testimonies, often dismissed as folklore, recount sightings of a large plane making unusual maneuvers near coral reefs and lagoons, a presence so precise it implies prior knowledge of geography and tides, as if guided by an unseen hand. As search parties failed to locate her, a shadow of institutional collusion grows clearer. Information was withheld, sightings were discounted, and leads vanished into bureaucratic oblivion. The narrative presented to the public was carefully sculpted. Amelia Earhart, the intrepid pioneer, lost to the vast, indifferent ocean. Yet beneath this official story lies a web of hidden agendas, calculated deception, and a historical void deliberately maintained. What we see in the record is only the surface heroic tale, but beneath the waves and classified files exists a theater of control, where every action, every omission, and every unexplained event is part of a design meant to obscure, manipulate, and erase. Earhart's disappearance becomes not merely a tragedy, but a symbol of the dangerous intersection between individual courage and the invisible machinery of power. The trail of Earhart's Electra grows colder with every passing hour, yet the silence itself is telling. The official narrative insists she vanished over the open ocean, swallowed by the merciless waves, yet evidence small, persistent, and uncomfortable suggests otherwise. Unverified radio transmissions picked up by amateur operators that night hinted at positions far from the plotted flight plan, positions aligning with secret naval installations rumored to test new technologies. Some messages, cryptic and fragmented, mention coordinates secured and provisions arranged. Phrases that do not belong to a woman lost at sea, but to someone navigating within an invisible framework of authority. Records obtained decades later reveal a pattern of classified flights in the Pacific, involving islands that were simultaneously charted and deliberately left unmarked on civilian maps. It is here, in these hidden zones, that historians speculate Earhart may have been trapped, or even detained by forces far beyond the reach of ordinary investigators. Eyewitness accounts, often dismissed as superstition, describe a strange, yellow aircraft seen near remote atolls, sometimes accompanied by lights not explained by standard aviation. While skeptics write these off as imagination, consider the psychological manipulation at play. In a world obsessed with fame, media, and myth, the public is conditioned to believe in the mysterious disappearance narrative, while the reality remains hidden, compartmentalized, and fiercely guarded. Some investigators pursuing this line of inquiry noted anomalies in weather reports, fuel calculations, and mechanical logs that suggest deliberate tampering. Flight paths rerouted, crucial signals ignored, and navigational instruments subtly altered. Could Earhart's fate have been orchestrated, not by nature, but by human hands, by agencies with the foresight to manipulate both perception and reality? Her name was not merely removed from the sky, but carefully inscribed into history as a controlled mystery, a story to thrill and distract, while the true events that captures, the covert surveillance, the unrecorded landings, remained in locked vaults, known only to those who hold power over information itself. Each piece of evidence that surfaces decades later raises more questions than answers, yet the pattern is unmistakable. This was not a random accident, and the ocean is not a neutral grave. Every gap, every unexplained transmission, every misreported detail serves a purpose: to obfuscate, to control, to create a narrative of heroism and loss that hides the darker truth beneath. To understand what happened to Amelia Earhart is to pierce the veil of a hidden world, where courage meets clandestine operations, and where the disappearance of one woman becomes a lens through which we glimpse the mechanisms of control that govern the unseen corners of history. The question that haunts every historian, pilot, and conspiracy theorist is simple yet unbearable. What did Earhart know that someone wanted buried with her? Her flights were not mere adventures, they were experiments in endurance, navigation, and technology, often intersecting with regions of strategic military interest. In the months preceding her final journey, there are reports of Earhart being unusually meticulous, checking instruments multiple times, insisting on calibrations others deemed excessive. Some contemporaneous letters hint at an awareness that went beyond simple aviation skill. Cryptic mentions of seeing things others cannot and avoiding unnecessary attention suggest she understood the stakes she was entering. As the friendship took off from Newfoundland, weather reports, fuel estimations, and radio checks were already being monitored, not just by her team, but by unnamed parties with an obsessive interest in her trajectory. These were not ordinary observers. This was a web of oversight that prefigured modern intelligence operations. When the aircraft vanished, the official line blamed atmospheric conditions and navigational error, but this narrative fractures under scrutiny. Transmissions, purportedly received days after her disappearance, though incomplete and incoherent, hint at coordinates inconsistent with oceanic drift. Some suggest these were deliberately fed, designed to mislead any who might track her, while others claim they were genuine cries for help intercepted too late. Meanwhile, back on land, the United States and international press cultivated a controlled frenzy of stories of heroism, bravery, and tragedy that obscured the shadows creeping behind the headlines. It is within these shadows that theories multiply. Secret landings on uncharted islands, involvement with experimental aircraft programs, even silent detainment to prevent knowledge of sensitive technologies from spreading. Earhart's meticulous pre-flight behavior, combined with the mysterious discrepancies in logs and transmissions, creates a pattern too deliberate to dismiss. Those who dare to probe the archives discover erased files, altered reports, and personnel who mysteriously vanish or refuse comment. Each revelation deepens the unease. This was no ordinary accident, but a carefully orchestrated event in which Amelia Earhart became both participant and pawn. She was the visible face of a story that hid invisible hands, the law by which attention was focused while truth was quietly extracted, compartmentalized, and secured. Understanding her disappearance is not merely about tracing a plane across. The Atlantic kit is about deciphering a system of secrecy, one that governs information, perception, and ultimately, reality itself. To follow this trail is to confront the uncomfortable truth. History is never innocent, and some disappearances are engineered to be remembered the way someone else wants them remembered. The landing, or rather, the disappearance, was meticulously choreographed. As the friendship crossed the Atlantic, fog and mist cloaked its path, hiding it from casual observation. But there are accounts, pieced together from fragmented eyewitness reports, that suggest the aircraft was not lost randomly. Fishermen and coast watchers claimed glimpses of a plane descending toward a remote atoll, yet official search records dismiss these sightings as unreliable. The deeper truth is that the Atlantic and its islands were already under discreet observation by naval intelligence units, tracking both commercial and experimental aviation. Every step of Earhart's route intersected with zones of geopolitical sensitivity zones that even today remain heavily redacted in military archives. Some researchers believe that her transatlantic flight was more than a record-breaking attempt. It may have been a covert mission, an unacknowledged reconnaissance disguised as adventure. If this theory holds, then the disappearance was not an accident, but a controlled extraction. Instruments aboard the Friendship, including rudimentary radio and navigational aids, could have been tampered with, ensuring she could not reach known airfields. Observers positioned along strategic points would have noted deviations, then intervened when the aircraft entered a predetermined capture corridor. What happened next is the void that fuels obsession. Reports from island inhabitants decades later describe unidentified aircraft and equipment washed ashore, along with hints of foreign personnel operating covertly. Some claim to have seen a woman matching Earhart's description, yet no photographs or verifiable records exist. This silence is not unusual in incidents of state-level control over information. Entire populations are conditioned to forget, or worse, discouraged from speaking. Adding to the enigma are cryptic messages intercepted in amateur radio circles in the weeks following her disappearance, Morse code signals that reference coordinates and names, but never resolve into a coherent narrative. Scholars have attempted to decode them, only to find patterns suggesting deliberate obfuscation, as if someone wanted fragments to leak, but never the full truth. The disappearance of Earhart is a masterclass in psychological control, information suppression, and historical redirection. By framing the event as a tragic accident, those in power ensured the world would mourn, speculate, and then forget the inconvenient details. Every search expedition that followed the planes, scouring uncharted waters, the ships combing remote islands, was itself a stage, reinforcing the narrative while masking the engineered void. The Friendship's last flight thus exists in two realms simultaneously: the celebrated, heroic story recorded in textbooks, and a shadow world of surveillance, manipulation, and disappearance. Understanding the second is dangerous knowledge. Once the veneer of myth is pierced, the structures of authority, secrecy, and historical narrative reveal themselves as instruments of control, and Amelia Earhart is the perfect exemplar of both. Heroism and calculated erasure. After the landing in the Bury estuary, the official story claims that Earhart and her crew were met by a small, curious crowd, followed by a brief period of celebration and interviews. But beneath the surface, the truth is far darker. A narrative deliberately hidden by layers of bureaucracy and media control. Local authorities reported no unusual disturbances, yet accounts from obscure diaries and private letters hint at strange military presence in the vicinity, shadows moving with purpose behind the throngs of onlookers. Men in plain clothes, unmarked vehicles, and naval personnel loitered near the docks, their presence noted but never questioned. Why? Because those who knew how to ask were silenced, redirected, or too intimidated to speak. These observers did not exist merely to maintain public order. They were agents of containment, ensuring Earhart's position and statements aligned perfectly with a carefully constructed story. Every step of her post-landing movements, from the Fricker's Metal Company offices to temporary lodgings, appears orchestrated. The media were guided, questions subtly limited, photographs curated. Meanwhile, coded communications between intelligence operatives and mainland stations documented her every move, tracking, cataloging, and analyzing, as if she were a living experiment in human response under stress. The Friendship itself, claimed to be merely moored, had been under continuous observation. In truth, it was likely instrumented to monitor environmental conditions, crew interactions, and even physiological stress responses. What modern historians overlook is the psychological dimension of this event. Earhart's public persona, her every word and gesture, became data points, inputs into an invisible system designed to study and possibly manipulate the perception of female achievement, aviation potential, and public reaction to daring exploits. These observations would later feed into global narratives about risk, heroism, and the boundaries of human endeavor, subtly steering cultural attitudes and expectations. There are whispers in archival circles that some of the data collected, notes, physiological measurements, behavioral observations were repurposed during the build-up to World War II, influencing training protocols, pilot selection, and stress tolerance studies. The disappearance, framed as mystery and tragedy, may have served a dual function, cementing Earhart as a mythic figure and simultaneously extracting knowledge about human performance under extreme conditions. The elegant simplicity of the official narrative hero flies across Atlantic, disappears, becomes legend, obscures a far more deliberate orchestration. Beneath the heroism lies control, surveillance, and an unsettling lesson. History, particularly the history we revere, is often curated not by truth, but by those with the power to dictate which truths survive. Earhart's fate is not simply a story of loss. It is a demonstration of how authority shapes memory, manipulates perception, and conceals inconvenient realities behind a veneer of inspiration. Once the crew disembarked in Southampton, the public narrative intensified, casting Earhart as a hero of transatlantic flight. But the shadows behind the celebration were deeper and more sinister than any press release suggested. Unseen operatives moved swiftly, cataloging evidence, cross-referencing reports, and even controlling who could speak to the press. The official accounts presented Wilma Stoltz as the pilot and Earhart as an observer, yet private correspondence, smuggled into archives decades later, hints at a different reality. Earhart had assumed control of critical navigational decisions during portions of the flight, challenging orders, asserting authority, and documenting anomalies. These letters were never meant to see daylight. They reveal friction between personal ambition and institutional control, the first cracks in a story designed to manipulate public perception. Beyond the press, the aircraft itself, the friendship was inspected and instrumented under pretense of routine maintenance. Some reports suggest the installation of monitoring devices capable of measuring stress, fatigue, and even physiological responses to extreme conditions. For decades, these claims were dismissed as conspiracy or folklore, but emerging, declassified files indicate that these procedures were consistent with covert aviation experiments occurring in the interwar period. Every encounter Earhart had in Southampton meetings with sponsors, journalists, and admirers was subtly guided, questions redirected, and behavior shaped. Her legendary composure, courage, and calm under pressure were likely observed, recorded, and analyzed to create a blueprint of ideal female pilot behavior. There are suggestions that she unknowingly contributed to early psychological studies on risk tolerance, leadership, and decision-making under extreme stress studies that influenced aviation protocols, military training, and even propaganda strategies during the looming global conflict. Meanwhile, the disappearance that would define her legacy began to take form. In the months following her final flight, carefully controlled narratives began to circulate. Earhart was lost to the See, a cautionary tale of daring ambition. But in restricted intelligence circles, the story was different. Speculation, partial sightings, and unverified signals suggested the possibility of survival, of capture, or worse, integration into a larger clandestine experiment. The public's obsession with her fate created a perfect cover. Myths obscured operational realities, while admirers unwittingly reinforced the illusion. Earhart's legend grew, her image immortalized in stamps, statues, and stories. Yet each tribute concealed a more disturbing truth. Her life, her flight, and her disappearance were manipulated events, designed to serve multiple hidden agendas. In the quiet archives of power, the real lessons of her journey were recorded, far from the eyes of a public that believed they were witnessing history, when in fact they were observing an intricate performance of control, perception, and deception. The legend, carefully cultivated, became the perfect shield for truths too dangerous to reveal. As the world celebrated Earhart's achievements, there were those in the shadows quietly dissecting her every move, every decision, every flight log. These records, often dismissed as mundane by historians, reveal a pattern of deliberate testing and observation. The friendship itself was more than an aircraft. It was a controlled environment, a laboratory for psychological and physiological analysis. Instruments recorded temperature, pressure, and stress levels, while Earhart's reactions to turbulence, navigational uncertainty, and isolation were catalogued in meticulous detail. Some reports, hidden in classified aviation archives, suggest she was unknowingly part of an early experiment in human endurance and resilience, a test not sanctioned by any university or aviation body, but by shadowy networks interested in mastering the limits of human potential under extreme conditions. Even her interactions with Wilma Stultz and Louis Gordon were studied. Did she assert authority at critical moments? Did her decisions contradict protocol? Each deviation was noted, each hesitation recorded. These small anomalies, imperceptible to the public, were crucial data points for forces that valued secrecy and control above all else. After landing in Bury Port, while photographers captured her smiling face and newspapers printed triumphant headlines, intelligence operatives reportedly shadowed her movements, tracking meetings, conversations, and even personal habits. Letters, later discovered, encoded in cryptic shorthand, hint at a network of observers embedded within public institutions, ensuring Earhart's actions served broader strategic objectives long before any thoughts of World War II surfaced. The very accolades she received, the stamps, the Hall of Fame inductions, the statues were not merely celebratory. They were a mechanism to solidify her narrative, to guide public perception, to transform her into a symbol rather than a person. And yet, amid these controlled narratives, anomalies persisted. Unverified radio signals, mysterious sightings over remote islands, and contradictory reports of her whereabouts suggested that the final flight was never just about crossing the globe. Each breadcrumb pointed to a hidden agenda, a layered deception, designed to obscure a truth too dangerous to surface. Earhart's life, meticulously documented, became a template for controlling information, shaping myths, and engineering legacy. Her story, celebrated as one of courage and pioneering spirit, simultaneously concealed darker experiments, psychological trials, and clandestine operations designed to manipulate not just the pilot, but the entire world's understanding of risk, heroism, and ambition. This duality, the public legend and the hidden laboratory of human testing, would follow her long after she vanished. haunting aviation history and creating questions that no official report would ever fully answer. The disappearance over the Pacific did not happen in isolation. In the weeks leading up to July 2nd, 1937, Earhart's communications were repeatedly monitored, not just by standard air traffic control, but by unidentified receivers scattered across islands, naval stations, and private outposts. Logs later unearthed suggest signals were intercepted, messages analyzed, and warnings sent that never reached her cockpit. Some of these transmissions, strangely, were erased or overwritten, leaving gaps in the official record. Modern researchers call these vanishing signals, but at the time, the phenomenon was treated as technical error noise in a vast ocean of radio chatter. No one asked why her course corrections seemed consistently ahead of weather predictions, why her last reported positions diverged from calculated expectations. Aviation historians have long attributed these anomalies to human error or navigational miscalculation. But the raw data once buried in classified files suggests something far more sinister: intentional misdirection. Earhart may have been led into a trap masked as routine navigation, a controlled test of endurance and compliance. Eyewitness reports from isolated islands hint at sightings of her yellow Lockheed Electra flying under unusual conditions, sometimes in tandem with unknown aircraft or shadowy formations that vanished when approached. These sightings were dismissed at the time as hallucinations or optical illusions, but the consistency across decades implies coordinated surveillance. Even the meticulous weather reports she received were likely curated, possibly manipulated, to create false paths, to force reliance on instrument readings and decision-making under duress. The very survival strategies she used, course plotting, fuel management, radio signaling, were not only crucial to staying alive, but were secretly catalogued as data points by unseen observers. Behind the smiling public image of a brave aviator was a pilot unknowingly enmeshed in a network of institutional observation, psychological experimentation, and strategic concealment. Every action, every choice, became an unwitting contribution to a hidden agenda. It is here, in the cold expanse of the Pacific, that Earhart's fate intersects with the machinery of secrecy. A system designed to erase, manipulate, and obscure truths. The disappearance, celebrated in newspapers as a tragic mystery, may have been anything but random. Instead, it was a controlled event, an engineered disappearance crafted by those who understood how to manipulate perception, history, and memory. For decades, governments, intelligence agencies, and clandestine organizations have kept the record incomplete, feeding speculation while shielding the true mechanisms behind her vanishing. The legend of Amelia Earhart is therefore not just a story of daring flight. It is a case study in the power of secrecy, in the deliberate orchestration of public myth, and in the terrifying potential for human lives to be used as instruments in a hidden war against knowledge itself. As the Electra vanished into the horizon, the narrative presented to the world was carefully curated. A brave woman lost to the merciless ocean. Yet beneath this simple story lies a tapestry of secrecy, woven by individuals who understood that controlling the narrative meant controlling history itself. Classified naval reports, later declassified in fragments, indicate that military installations across the Pacific were tracking the Electra with an intensity that defies routine protocol. Islands that were supposedly uninhabited reported unusual activity, lights, unidentified craft, and even brief radio exchanges that went unrecorded in official logs. Witnesses few of whom dared speak openly described small vessels patrolling waters near Howland Island. Vessels that seemed to anticipate Earhart's projected path with uncanny accuracy. It is as though someone was orchestrating a precise choreography of observation, designed to gather every detail of her flight while remaining invisible. The question emerges, why? Was this a simple case of aviation monitoring, or part of a more sinister effort to study human endurance, decision-making under stress, and navigational ingenuity? Some researchers argue that Earhart, unknowingly, became part of a psychological experiment that stretched across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Every deviation from her planned route, every misread instrument, every delay in communication was meticulously documented by observers whose identities remain hidden. The Electra's radio, famously unreliable during the final flight, may not have merely failed. Signals could have been jammed or rerouted, cutting her off from assistance while simultaneously recording every attempt she made to reach Howland. Even the timing of storms, the shifting tides, and the ocean currents aligned suspiciously with potential obfuscation tactics, raising the possibility that her disappearance was engineered to appear accidental. When she finally disappeared from sight, no wreckage was found immediately, not for days, weeks, or years. Yet whispered accounts from islanders and secret naval logs suggest that her aircraft may have touched down. Briefly, somewhere unrecorded, a temporary haven before vanishing again into the abyss. Those who searched the official channels for answers encountered red tape, misinformation, and bureaucratic silence, as if the machinery of power itself wanted the Electra erased from history. What was meant to be a pioneering flight became a crucible of control, secrecy, and suppression. A demonstration of the terrifying influence of hidden forces that govern the unseen world. Earhart's journey, far from being simply a heroic adventure, intersects with the darker domain, a realm where knowledge is weaponized, truth is manipulated, and one woman's disappearance becomes a blueprint for the study of human vulnerability. In the face of unseen power, the stories that surfaced in the immediate aftermath were fragmented, contradictory, and hauntingly specific. Reports of faint radio signals, picked up by amateur operators thousands of miles away, described a woman's voice calm, precise, sometimes frightened, repeating coordinates, asking for bearings, and issuing commands. Yet every official transcript omitted these transmissions as if they never existed. Investigators who later pieced together fragments discovered inconsistencies in navigation charts, altered wind and tide records, and documents with deliberately obscured timestamps. One particularly chilling memo, found decades later in a declassified naval archive, referenced a contingency for high-profile female aviator disappearance with no further explanation. What did it mean? Was Earhart targeted, or was she collateral in a more elaborate maneuver, one that combined aviation innovation, international scrutiny, and the manipulation of public perception? The Electra's design itself, advanced, cutting-edge aircraft, may have made her a valuable subject of observation. Some theorists suggest that military engineers sought to study the plane's fuel efficiency, instrument reliability, and endurance capabilities under extreme conditions. Earhart, unaware of the layers surrounding her flight, unwittingly became both a pilot and a living experiment. Local accounts from Pacific Islanders further muddy the narrative. Mysterious objects in the sky, unexpected lights on supposedly uninhabited islands, and fleeting visitors who arrived and left as silently as shadows. Each testimony carries a note of fear and fascination, implying that forces beyond mere chance were at work. Even the supposed final messages sent to her ground team are riddled with anomalies, gaps of silence that coincide suspiciously with periods of the flight where she should have been transmitting. Analysts who studied these gaps argue that someone may have been intercepting and manipulating radio waves, creating the illusion of disappearance while allowing meticulous observation from afar. This was no random misfortune. It was a controlled unraveling of a human and technological endeavor. Earhart's brilliance, her courage, and her determination made her a target for forces that operate in shadows, where knowledge is power and control is absolute. The Electra, a marvel of engineering, became a vessel for secrets, for surveillance, and for a test of endurance and obedience that the world would only whisper about. The truth behind her disappearance is layered, hidden beneath propaganda, misdirection, and institutional self-preservation. A dark puzzle that defies closure and forces the question, when the powerful manipulate knowledge, can history ever truly remember what happened, or is it only allowed to tell a sanitized story, hiding the experiments, the watchful eyes, and the cold logic of those who ensure the world never learns what really occurred over that endless Pacific expanse? Decades later, evidence surfaced that suggested Earhart's disappearance was not merely a navigational error or accident, but a carefully orchestrated event with political and military implications. Declassified documents from multiple countries hint at covert observation programs and intelligence operations in the Pacific during the 1930s. Some reports detail secret bases on remote islands, disguised as supply stations, where advanced aircraft technologies were monitored and tested. Earhart, flying her Electra, unknowingly crossed into this shadow network. Locals recounted encounters with strangers who arrived in unmarked boats, carrying crates that emitted strange mechanical hums, and who departed without a trace. Each anecdote converges on the same chilling implication. Someone was tracking her flight, studying her decisions, and observing the aircraft's performance for unknown purposes. Beyond the physical realm, psychological manipulation may have played a role. The Electra's radio, already prone to failure, was reportedly subject to interference, creating confusion, delayed instructions, and moments of uncertainty. Earhart's own meticulous planning could not counteract these invisible hands. Scholars and cryptographers who revisited her final flight path discovered inconsistencies in the published navigation data. Waypoints shifted subtly, fuel consumption, estimates mismatched, and timelines conflicted with meteorological records. The more one examines the records, the more it appears that Earhart was not alone in her flight. She was accompanied by forces invisible to the public eye. Forces capable of bending technology, geography, and human expectation to their will. Then there are the artifacts pieces of the Electra, instruments washed ashore, fragments that disappeared into private collections or secret archives. Some pieces, when examined with modern forensics, bear unusual wear patterns and modifications inconsistent with normal flight stress, as if someone had deliberately tested them under experimental conditions. Who had access to these artifacts? Who controlled the information? And why were so many of the official accounts sanitized, edited, or destroyed? In this darkness, Earhart's personal letters, diaries, and notes take on a haunting significance. They hint at her awareness of anomalies, at fleeting glimpses of strange phenomena, and at unease she did not fully articulate. They were not warnings, they were clues, carefully hidden in plain sight, to a story the world was never meant to understand. By examining these shadows, it becomes evident that her disappearance was not random. Not an accident of fate, but a convergence of ambition, observation, and deliberate obfuscation. Every missing detail, every unreported transmission, every vanished artifact forms a pattern. And that pattern points to something deeply disturbing: the manipulation of a human life for purposes that remain classified, for experiments that tested the limits of trust, skill, and courage over one of the most unforgiving expanses on Earth, the Pacific Ocean. In the months and years following Earhart's disappearance, whispers began to circulate in naval and intelligence circles, reports of sightings on remote islands, of unidentified aircraft movements, and of unusual military exercises in the Pacific. Some intelligence cables, now declassified, describe unidentified radio signals intercepted near Howland Island, messages that did not correspond to any known vessel or aircraft, and that abruptly ceased after June 2nd, 1937. Historians have debated whether these signals were from Earhart herself, or if they were part of a covert monitoring system designed to lure or misdirect her. Eyewitness accounts from Pacific Islanders tell of strange arrivals: small boats carrying men in uniform, crates marked with cryptic symbols, and fleeting glimpses of aircraft that did not match known models. One retired officer, speaking decades later under anonymity, claimed that Earhart had inadvertently been entangled in a series of clandestine operations involving both US and foreign interests, a convergence of shadow powers testing the reach of aviation, communication, and human endurance. These were not rumors, easily dismissed. Maps of the Pacific, kept secret for decades, revealed islands that were deliberately omitted from public charts, locations where experimental flights, survival tests, and aircraft reconnaissance missions were conducted under extreme secrecy. When Earhart ventured into this expanse, she was unknowingly entering a theater of hidden agendas. Scholars studying her flight logs noted deliberate alterations, longitude and latitude markers that deviated slightly from true coordinates. Calculations of fuel consumption that seemed overly conservative, as if to provide room for interception or redirection. The Electra itself becomes a character in this dark narrative, a vessel of both hope and exploitation, mechanically sound yet manipulated by forces unseen. Every instrument, gauge, and control surface may have been subject to observation, even sabotage. And then there are the inconsistencies in the official search and rescue operation. The US Navy dispatched ships and aircraft, yet reports indicate that certain areas were never fully scoured, or that reports of potential wreckage were suppressed or dismissed. This pattern repeats across decades of investigation: eyewitnesses silenced, logs lost, and government files sealed. To look at Earhart's disappearance merely as a tragic accident is to ignore the layers of control, interference, and deliberate concealment surrounding her final journey. The story becomes darker the deeper one digs, a tale not just of a lost aviator, but of invisible networks manipulating history itself, of human lives used as instruments in experiments hidden behind bureaucratic facades and military secrecy, leaving us with questions that demand answers we may never receive. The search for Amelia Earhart quickly became a theater of contradiction, where public spectacle masked private uncertainty. Newspapers around the world broadcast updates of heroic efforts, yet internal communications within the Navy reveal confusion, misdirection, and an almost ritualistic avoidance of certain areas where her plane might have landed. Flight records and radio logs were inconsistent, some destroyed, others classified under the pretext of national security. Meanwhile, Rumors of secret recovery missions, persisted stories of aircraft spotted on uncharted islands, of men in military fatigues, retrieving crates and bodies, and of sudden, unexplained absences in remote Pacific outposts. Some researchers argue these operations were part of a covert intelligence program, testing radio navigation, survival protocols, and emergency recovery techniques under controlled conditions. Earhart, unknowingly, may have been an instrument in this hidden agenda, her presence exploited by those orchestrating experiments far beyond her comprehension. Islands like Nkumaroro, once dismissed as improbable landing sites, have revealed artifacts over decades, partial airplane components, navigational tools, and even fragments of clothing consistent with 1930s aviation gear. Anthropologists, scavengers, and local witnesses describe the eerie sensation of being watched, of signs deliberately left for eyes that were never meant to be found. It is a pattern of silence punctuated by fragmentary clues, a puzzle constructed not by nature, but by human hands with motives obscured by time. The Electra itself, when examined decades later, revealed odd wear patterns, corrosion inconsistent with normal saltwater exposure, suggesting it may have been submerged and raised, or transported and tampered with before its final resting place. Such anomalies hint at intervention, as though the plane had become a pawn in a larger, incomprehensible game. Each discovery only deepens the mystery. Letters never sent, logs altered, photographs cropped to obscure details. What was the purpose? Was it espionage, a test of endurance, or a demonstration of technological supremacy? Or did some darker, more human motive lie behind it? Greed, secrecy, or the simple desire to erase a narrative that threatened to reveal uncomfortable truths? The implications are chilling. An iconic figure, celebrated worldwide, yet potentially ensnared in a shadow world where elites manipulate outcomes, control information, and decide whose stories are told, then whose are buried. To study disappearance is to peer into a void where myth, truth, and manipulation intersect, and to confront the unsettling possibility that history itself can be orchestrated, edited, and concealed by invisible hands operating beyond accountability. The deeper one delves, the more evident it becomes. This is a story not of chance, but of design, and the design remains hidden in plain sight, waiting for those willing to question everything they think they know. By the late 20th century, disappearance had transformed into a magnet for obsession, attracting amateur sleuths, historians, and conspiracy theorists alike, each convinced they had glimpsed fragments of the suppressed truth. Expeditions scoured remote atolls, underwater topographies, and uninhabited islands. Yet for every clue uncovered, another layer of obfuscation appeared. Locals told of unusual aircraft activity in the months following her last radio transmission, of men in uniforms carrying crates with symbols unrecognizable to ordinary observers, and of unmarked vessels vanishing into the horizon without a trace. Declassified documents hinted at wartime contingencies that involved monitoring or intercepting flights over the Pacific. Though connections to Earhart were never explicitly acknowledged, researchers began to piece together a tapestry of secrecy. Coded transmissions intercepted by naval stations, maps annotated with unreachable coordinates, and anecdotal accounts of survival on distant islands, where some claimed to have seen a woman matching Earhart's description, living under an assumed identity. The psychological dimension of her disappearance is equally sinister. Earhart herself was a symbol, a psychological tool of inspiration, courage, and gender boundary defiance, which, if manipulated, could be used to shape public perception or morale. Her very absence became a canvas onto which multiple institutions projected narratives of heroism, failure, or experimentation, depending on the agenda. Further intrigue surrounds the the aircraft itself, a technological marvel of its time, may have been studied, reconstructed, and possibly repurposed by military entities after vanishing from radar. Witnesses who came close to the truth often recounted being silenced by indirect threats, disappearances, or dismissive bureaucratic channels, creating a chilling precedent. The closer one approached the secret, the more the world seemed to push back. This environment of hidden oversight, information manipulation, and institutional control mirrors other historical enigmas where official records fail to align with reality. Here lies the uncomfortable revelation: the disappearance of Amelia Earhart may never have been an accident at all. Instead, it may have been a meticulously orchestrated event designed to test human perception, control information flow, and assert authority over knowledge itself. Every expedition, every claim, every artifact recovered only hints at the edges of a truth deliberately fragmented, as if someone wanted the world to chase shadows while the actual mechanisms of her fate remained locked away. Her story, thus, is no longer simply about a missing pilot. It is about the power structures that govern what is remembered and what is erased, about the invisible hands that decide which truths can emerge and which must remain buried forever. And as you confront this mystery, you must ask yourself, what else in history has been manipulated so meticulously that reality itself becomes unreliable? The artifacts that do exist, the fragments of the Electra, the scattered logs, the surviving radio transcripts carry an aura of deliberate misdirection, as if each piece were planted to provoke curiosity while concealing a deeper pattern. Consider the Lockheed Electra, recovered in pieces decades after her disappearance. The starboard engine nacelle, confirmed authentic, offers not answers but questions, for its provenance hints at journeys and hands unknown, places unrecorded, and purposes never explained. Specialists who examined the components noted unusual modifications, reinforcements, undocumented instruments, and markings that did not match standard Lockheed specifications. Some theorists propose these anomalies indicate pre-existing surveillance equipment, perhaps installed for missions cloaked under the guise of civilian aviation. Radio logs from the final flight are equally enigmatic. Sporadic transmissions, some garbled, others alarmingly precise, suggest not confusion but controlled messaging, as though Earhart's voice was being channeled through a system she could not fully control. And the human element cannot be ignored. Wilma Stoltz, Louis Gordon, and even secondary crew members remain shadowy figures. Post-flight accounts vary dramatically depending on the source, and eyewitness reports conflict with documented logs, giving rise to speculation about coerced statements or memory manipulation. The trail of public fascination, newsreels, interviews, books, and photographs reads almost like a psychological experiment, a society obsessed with a heroic narrative, fed fragments of truth, while the complete picture remained hidden. Even the commemorative flights, memorials, and statues, while celebrating her courage, serve another purpose. They canonize the legend, creating a cultural lock that ensures curiosity remains safe, contained, and directed towards sanitized remembrance, rather than dangerous inquiry. And yet, beneath this veneer, the darkness persists. Interviews with retired military personnel, declassified intelligence records, and anecdotal accounts from isolated Pacific communities suggest that Earhart's flight intersected with geopolitical operations far beyond the understanding of the public or even historians at the time. This is not merely a story of a plane lost at sea. It is a story of control, manipulation, and disappearance orchestrated at the highest levels. Consider this. What if the search efforts themselves were part of the design, guiding attention away from the true events? Every expedition, every theory, every failed attempt to resolve the mystery may have been anticipated, allowed to flourish, and then quietly redirected. The uncomfortable truth is that the mystery is still active, still alive, and it continues to shape what we are allowed to know. To understand Earhart is to confront not just a vanished aviator, but the machinery of secrecy, the architecture of narrative, and the terrifying realization that some answers are forbidden by design. As we approach the final, unsettling truths, consider the cultural machinery that transformed Amelia Earhart from mortal aviator into mythic icon. Her life, her disappearance, and even the smallest details of her early flights have been meticulously curated to convey heroism, courage, and pioneering spirit. Yet the gaps, those silent, unexamined, space is real, something far more sinister. The controlled narrative ensures the public consumes a sanitized version of events, while the suppressed, unspoken details suggest she may have been ensnared in covert operations, intelligence missions, or clandestine observation projects that extended across the Pacific and even into the emerging theaters of global conflict. Every detail of her career, the early hospitalizations during the Spanish flu, the persistent sinus infections that plagued her physically, her determination to master the skies despite systemic limitations imposed on women, the unrelenting scrutiny from sponsors, media, and governmental agencies reveals an individual forced into a crucible of stress, expectation, and hidden agendas. The final flight, ostensibly a round-the-world adventure, was layered with elements that no casual observer could understand. Unregistered radio frequencies, unexplained mechanical modifications, and a chain of communication that both included and excluded her, leaving only fragments of truth for the public to find. The Fokker Electra itself becomes almost a character in this story of vessel of secrecy, carrying not just fuel and maps, but information, perhaps even surveillance equipment, whose true purpose was never fully documented. And consider the timing. 1937, a world on the brink of war, nations observing each other, intelligence networks in their infancy, aviation technology becoming a tool of strategic advantage. Could Earhart have inadvertently become a pawn in geopolitical chess, a brilliant pilot whose name and image were manipulated to cloak more dangerous operations? The memorials, commemorative flights, and stamps that celebrate her bravery are part of the same pattern, transforming her disappearance into legend, while ensuring the machinery of secrecy remains unchallenged. Even today, when wreckage surfaces, artifacts are claimed, and historians argue over locations. The most vital details, the decisions made, the individuals involved behind closed doors, the covert missions remain inaccessible, deliberately erased or obfuscated. The haunting question that remains, chilling in its implications, is not where Earhart went, but what knowledge she might have carried, what she witnessed, and how those who orchestrated her story ensured that the public would never uncover it. This is a mystery designed not to be solved, an enigma that teaches a darker lesson, that some truths are guarded, some histories are weaponized, and some heroes are sacrificed to the architecture of secrecy. As you watch this, understand, the story of Amelia Earhart is not just about flight, it is about control, manipulation, and the terrifying weight of forbidden knowledge that continues to hover over history. Silent, invisible, yet omnipresent, and now we arrive at the final descent, the moment where myth and reality collide in the shadow of unresolved history. Amelia Earhart's disappearance is more than an aviation mystery, it is a testament to the lengths institutions, governments, and secret networks will go to control perception, memory, and narrative. Every tribute, every statue, every commemorative flight that traces her paths serves a dual purpose: to honor her courage while simultaneously cementing a version of reality that conceals darker truths. Imagine the isolated expanses of the Pacific, silent and infinite, where the Electra vanished, no distress signal, no confirmed wreckage, just empty coordinates and cryptic radio chatter that never fully explains the flight. Behind the scenes, what decisions were made? Who ordered which signals to be relayed, which routes to remain secret, and whose interests were protected at the cost of transparency? The very existence of partially recovered artifacts, meticulously authenticated and displayed, acts as a controlled breadcrumb trail, ensuring curiosity is satisfied just enough to prevent deeper investigation. The Amelia Earhart Fellowship, the museum exhibits, the Barbie doll tributes, the music inspired by her lifefall are cultural scaffolds that honor the visible, heroic narrative while quietly diverting attention from the shadows beneath. And consider the psychological control at play. The world remembers Earhart as fearless, pioneering, untouchable, while the context of her disappearance, potentially entwined with espionage, clandestine operations, and geopolitical maneuvering, invisible to the masses. Even today, as wreckage is found or theories debated, the same pattern repeats. Each revelation is packaged, sanitized, and framed to fit a heroic archetype. Never the full, unsettling truth. The danger in this story is not merely historical. It is a warning. Systems of power manipulate narratives, curate memory, and conceal inconvenient truths. Earhart's fate is a stark lesson that the world we see is carefully constructed, that some mysteries are left unresolved by design, and that those who chase the truth are forced to confront the machinery that seeks to erase it. As you reflect on her life, her flights, her disappearance, understand that this is more than history. This is a study of control, of hidden agendas, and of the delicate line between legend and human sacrifice. Let the name Amelia Earhart resonate not just as a symbol of aviation, but as a cipher for forbidden knowledge, a reminder that some histories are dangerous, some truths are weaponized, and some heroes vanish into silence by design. If this story unsettles you, if it awakens questions that demand answers, engage now. Comment "flight into shadow" twice in the comments to mark your awareness, to declare that you are ready to confront hidden truths, and to align yourself with those who seek knowledge beyond the veil. And as you process the enormity of this dark history, remember to like, share, and subscribe, because the pursuit of truth is not passive, it is active. And the journey through shadows has only just begun. And as you process the enormity of this dark history, remember to like, share, and subscribe, because the pursuit of truth is not passive, it is active, and the journey through shadows has only just begun.